Hey friends, welcome back to another episode of Theology. And around my guest today is the one and only Dr. Anthony B. Bradley, who has a Ph.D. from Westminster Theological Seminary, and he is also, or is currently serving as a Theologian-In-Residence at Redeemer Presbyterian Church. He's a distinguished research fellow at the Acton Institute, research professor of interdisciplinary and theological studies at Kuyper College, is the author of several books, including the recent Heroic Fraternities, Faith in Society, Why Black Lives Matter, and many other books. He's got a long rap sheet. I'm only reading part of it. For this podcast conversation, we talk a lot about fatherhood, masculinity, biblical masculinity, toxic masculinity, Jordan Peterson, and all that fun stuff. And I've just really appreciated Anthony's voice from a distance. He's got piles of wisdom, as you will see in this really engaging conversation. So please welcome to the show for the first time, the one and only Dr. Anthony B. Bradley. All right, I'm here with Dr. Anthony Bradley. This is a conversation. It's a long time in the making, in my heart, at least. I've been wanting to have you on for years. I want to. So anyway, thanks for coming on Theology Raw, Anthony.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
You don't know this, but I first heard of you at an ETS meeting, Evangelical Theological Society, the annual meeting. You gave a paper, I want to say it was over 20 years ago. You might have been a PhD student at Westminster, I think. Maybe you're at Covenant at that time. It was on the emerging church back when that was a thing. And you said something like, the title was Emerging Church, and the subtitle was something like, Yeah, Right. And it sounded so what we would call like Theo Bro now. But I don't remember what I ate for breakfast yesterday, let alone papers from a theological conference 20 years ago. I still remember, though, you began that paper. I can't believe I remember this. Half the paper was kind of critical thoughts and everything, but then you started to say, well, here's some good things about this movement. So, yeah, right. But then you're like, yeah, right. Like, yeah, this is right. Like some of the critiques they had. And dude, that I just was like, first of all, that usually doesn't happen at ETS, kind of like a nuanced critique of something everybody just wants to bash. And I was like, see, this is what we need. We need people to be able to see, like, is there something good in this? Is there something bad? Let's have a critical evaluation, but let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. So anyway, do you remember that paper? Did I summarize it somewhat?
Yeah, it's interesting because I remember they had to switch rooms.
It was so big, yeah.
I was teaching at Covenant Seminary at the time, and back then, I can say this publicly now, although I don't know if I could have said it back then. But back then, I had 2 feet fairly planted in Mark Driscoll's world.
Okay,
but I also had another foot very, very securely planted in Rob Bell's world.
Oh, interesting.
So I knew this whole landscape in ways that people had no idea about. No idea.
Oh, I did not know that. Because that's right when they started kind of parting ways, right?
Yeah.
Because at the beginning they were kind of seeing eye to eye on a lot of things, at least.
It was just so fascinating because both their churches were named Mars Hill.
That's right.
Right.
That's right.
And you also had, it was really sort of the split between, I'd say, the Acts 29 expression of this versus the Brian McLaren expression. He had some kind of organization. I don't remember the name of it now, but it was sort of the Acts 29 version versus the Brian McLaren version. And everyone in a traditional denomination, the PCA, the Presbyterian Church in America, or the Southern Baptists, were trying to figure out how to navigate between these basically non-denominational expressions of the emergent movement. And I was just really fascinated by it in part. And in fairness, I think you see some of these issues reemerge in the deconstruction, ex-evangelical conversation. But there were some gaps that a lot of young people experienced in their spiritual nurture from childhood, and maybe even some wounds. And they didn't have a space to work those things out. And one of the things that you saw with both in Mark Driscoll's space, but also Rob Bell's space, was an opportunity for a lot of emerging young adults at the time. It's interesting, right? Those young adults now have minivans and kids in college. but it provided it provided a third space for them to work out some of those issues. And this was, before TikTok and YouTube and things like that. So they didn't really have another context for that, which is why those Numas were so huge. Those Rob Bell Numa videos from back then. So I was fascinated by that, and I'm glad that you remember that, because I was just deeply swimming in the ocean of the emergent church, trying to figure out what the heck's going on and where do I fit in there.
You mentioned without the whole emergent church movement, early 2000s, prior to social media, I wonder what that would have looked like in this day and age. Well, it might be the deconstruction exit. Well, what would be the Mark Driscoll? Well, we don't need to get into that. It's not. I'm curious what the Mark Driscoll route of that would have been that remained very evangelical, but very kind of like gritty, and I remember at the time, the early Driscoll, I found it refreshing because I came out of like MacArthur circles. So, but then I'd moved away from that. Like I really understood, like contextualizing the gospel, getting outside the walls of the church and getting out into the actual real world, like hanging out with real world people, but still being gospel centered. Like Driscoll really hit that early on. I probably listened to maybe 4 sermons in my life of him. I read maybe 1 book or something. So it wasn't like I was a huge follower, but I saw something here. I'm like, oh, I kind of resonate with this. And then once things started to go south there, I was like, oh yeah, that seems pretty toxic. But I was never that deep into it. Anyway, well, Anthony, I brought you on because I really want to talk to you about masculinity. I know you've been thinking through this a lot, and I'm almost embarrassed. So people watching this video are going to see that I have glasses on for the first time in Theology and history. I actually do wear glasses when I drive and stuff, but I'm actually trying to cover a black eye that I got yesterday because I was wrestling with my son, which usually happens about 3 times a day. And he's getting older, he's getting bigger, and it's not uncommon for me to get injured after we wrestle. But yesterday, I was throwing my suitcase at him. He's throwing his soccer bag at me. We're waiting outside the airport, coming home from a trip, and his soccer bag hit me in the face, and it got all bloody. I'm like, dude, I got like interviews tomorrow and stuff. So anyway, I feel a little embarrassed. I feel like I got beat up by my son, and then I'm going to talk to you about masculinity. And you have any thoughts on that, Anthony?
You could have just asked your wife to put some makeup on you or something. I mean, you could have gotten, makeup to come on the show. Actually, this is really important, and I want everyone who's listening to pay attention to this fact. One of the things that we know in the psych data is that boys who roughhouse with their dads are much less likely to struggle with video game and porn addictions. They're also much more likely to have growing expertise and practice in delayed gratification. They're much more likely to be self-regulated in terms of their emotions. They're much more likely to understand the limitations and the range is in terms of how their bodies work. It's actually it's like a magic pill. It's the secret sauce in really low impact training for men in terms of how to be really mature adults. When I was teaching college, it got to a point when I discovered this data. And by the way, this data comes from a book by Warren Farrell. He has a co-author, I think John Gray. The book is titled The Boy Crisis. There's a whole chapter there's a whole section in the book on this, but roughhousing is something that every father needs to do because it really sets sons up for success. So when I was a college professor, it got to a point where if I found a young man who was spiritually grounded, had an even keel temperament, his grades were good, I would just simply ask the question. First question, not where you're from. First question, did you and your father roughhouse? And the answer was always yes. It was always yes. And sometimes the roughhousing dropped away in middle school or high school. Sometimes it dropped away early. But in terms of a boy's development, it is absolutely vital and necessary. And I would go so far as to say this, that boys who don't roughhouse with their dads are the ones who end up in juvenile detention in high school and in prison as early adults. And the fact that you have that wound, that scar on your face, your son learned a really valuable lesson about the limitations of his strength. He learned a valuable lesson that he can actually hurt someone. And so now he's much more likely to self-regulate the next time because he doesn't want to see his dad bleed, unless he thought it was really funny. He's much more likely to actually learn how to regulate his physical strength because he knows, I can't put my knee here, right? I can't put my hand here. I can't swing a bag of balls, soccer balls, at my dad's head. These are some things I can do. These are some things that I can't do, and it's really, really vital. And I would say this here lastly: the delayed gratification value and variable here is massively important, because one of the things that roughhousing does is it puts the son in a position where he anticipates the reward of the play, of the roughhousing. So basically, as a parent, you can say this: we can roughhouse when you finish your homework. We can wrestle when I come back from the trip. We can do this after you do what your mom says. Right? After you do X, Y, and Z, we can do this. And it always, always works. And it teaches delayed gratification. And the very last thing, I said that was my last one, but this is actually the very last point. It actually builds intimacy and connection. So boys who roughhouse with their dads are much more likely to share problems. They're much more likely to be to bring to them their questions. They feel safe. They feel secure. They're much more likely to take risks, etc. So I always tell dads, listen, as much as possible, for as long as possible, roughhouse with the lads. And I don't care if he's 17, 6 years old, or 22. When he comes home, just go ahead and tackle him and see what happens. You're always going to experience laughter. Always going to experience laughter and smiles, and both the father and the son get releases of dopamine and oxytocin in the context of that.
This is blowing my mind, dude. So I always want to ask the question, causation correlation. It sounds like you're saying there's a lot more. This isn't just like going back to like keeping them out of prison or something. Is that just happens to be correlated, or is there something more causative? And it sounds like you're saying causative. You're building a bond. All these. It's fostering all kinds of different virtues and relationship bonding and everything. So it's not just correlation, you're saying?
Yeah, because one of the things that we see in the psych data is the absence of this leads to a set of pathologies. Right now, it's not determinative. So here's what I'm not saying. What I'm not saying is like, well, unless you roughhouse with your boys, he's going to end up being an axe murderer. I'm not saying that at all. And I'm also not saying, well, if you roughhouse with your son, he'll end up being a priest or something, right? He'll just be godly and things like that. But there are strong associations with the level and the frequency with which men physically engage their children. Right? I mean, and it actually benefits both the dad and the children. Dad's brains change in terms of the more interaction they have with their kids. And the data is also pretty clear on this, that empathy is learned from fathers, not mothers.
Really?
Absolutely, yeah. And it's counterintuitive for most, but one of the things, for example, that happened in the context of your play, and this is often where empathy is learned, is during play, is that you now have a scar on your face, right? And so your son, in the context of play and seeing this wound on your face, is now going to be more empathetic to his impact toward other people because he sees that he can hurt someone. So now he's thinking, well, I need to think about my dad. I mean, I'm getting bigger. I can take the man now, right? I can hurt him.
Well, let's not. Yeah, let's not go too far.
Get him on this podcast. Yeah,
he slipped one in, but
it's like, yeah, you can take him now, can't you? Actually, he probably can't. We have this thing called old man strength.
Yeah,
but he's learning to sort of think about your body in the context of the exercise of his physical strength. It is fathers who are actually the rule enforcers. Kids can work their moms. Dad's the one that says, no, do what your mom says. Mm-hmm. Right? Go to bed. You broke the window. I'm going to take you across the street. You're going to apologize. You're going to buy a new window. And in fact, you're going to help the man paint the thing. Okay. Mm-hmm. I'll teach you how to do it. I'm going to take it to Home Depot. You're going to take your allowance money to go buy it. Right. And so this other centeredness is actually fostered by the dads. And the data is really clear on this as well, that the more time children spend with their dads, the more empathetic they are.
If their dad is modeling that,
if their dad is actively fathering them, actually forming them, actually engaging them on the virtues of wisdom and thinking about other people, he doesn't even need to use the word empathy. Doesn't need to say, hey, be empathetic or be compassionate. He doesn't need to do that. But if he relates to his son and his daughter, if he relates to his kids in such a way that has them think about the impacts of what they do on other people, if that's the nature of some of the things they discuss, is et cetera, they're going to, because they respect their dad, love their dad, listen to their dad, et cetera, they're going to be the ones who actually internalize empathy. And we know this in the juvenile space. A criminal deviance, by definition, is in part a lack of empathy, right? You don't care if you steal the car. You don't care about their feelings if you steal their jewelry, if you murder someone in their family. The whole basis of restorative justice is empathy. So when single moms, and by the way, when I say this, I'm not blaming single moms and saying that single moms are deficient, but it is no accident that the large majority of juveniles in the juvenile detention space are boys raised by single moms, because they actually need a father's presence to help form empathy as a way to cultivate impulse control, aggression management, and also to help them form the habits of thinking about other people's feelings on the basis of their own activities.
That's interesting. And yeah, you said it before, and I just want to reiterate, you're speaking in generalities, not absolute. I mean, so like I was raised by a single mom. My dad never wrestled with me, you know. Well, no, when I was little, he did. He left when I was 10. Yeah, but I didn't end up in prison. I did, you know, all that. So I would be more the exception. So these aren't absolutes. And I guess that I do have a question about that. Like, what do you do with the eating father listening whose kid doesn't like rough and tumble play? Maybe, yeah, I know most boys do, but some boys don't. And then I want to flip it around. What about girls? Is there any kind of crossover for? I have 3 daughters and 1 son, and my third daughter loves to wrestle. Her problem is she's taken jiu-jitsu and she can actually choke me out. Like she can, and she has really long, strong legs. And if she wraps you, she's like a boa constrictor. So I'm like, there's been times when she's literally tapped me out. But like, is there so 2 questions. What do you do with the son who just, are there sons where it's counterproductive? They just don't like it. It has a reverse effect. They're just wired differently. And then is there crossover with fathers and daughters?
Great 2 questions. So absolutely. I mean, there are some boys, their temperament isn't necessarily wired that way, which is perfectly fine, right? Those tend to be more the exception than the rule, but sure. Absolutely. And so what parents need to do in that sense, because all your kids are different, is to figure out a way of connection and a way of fostering the same level, the same sorts of outcomes in terms of delayed gratification, impulse control, anger regulation, aggression regulation, emotion regulation. It doesn't necessarily have to be through roughhousing, but it does typically happen through play.
Okay.
Like that's usually the mechanism that these things are fostered is during play. So it may not be rough and tumble play, but it could be some other form of play.
Okay.
Right. So playing with your kids, doing activities together with your kids is really important. And like I said, it needs to be something where there's some frustration, right? There's some challenge or some obstacle, and you get to love and care and communicate important things in the context of that struggle, and them encountering the limitations of their capacity, but also being able to see that they also have the ability to cause harm. So those are really the context, the principles that really matter. How that's done, a rough and tumble play or a chess match, right? You know how sometimes kids get frustrated when they lose. I mean, those are the sorts of contexts that matter. But it really does, particularly in our era. Those things are developed in the context of play. Now, for girls, absolutely, those sorts of physical interactions are important, but the rough and tumble play with girls is going to be different, and dads are going to naturally regulate the ways in which they toss and tumble their daughters, right? There's a great video I've seen of a dad doing this on social media, where he basically grabs his son's leg and kind of does that, throws him on the bed. But with his daughter, he cradles her, does a spin around, and then lays her down. That gives the appearance of being hard, but he has her head cradled in his hand and then bounces her down like that.
Yeah.
So the rough and tumble play has some variants, right? There's age appropriate, right? You have to do that in terms of think about how you go about it. You're not going to wrestle a 4-year-old in the same way you're going to wrestle your 15-year-old, right? But also, your kids, and because you are their father, you know exactly what some of those limitations are, and you as a dad know the best way to do it. So there are probably going to be no two fatherly expressions of these activities, but again, the important thing is to play and to do whatever is necessary to be physically engaged with your children to create laughter and fun. Those are the sorts of things that open the door later on for the types of trust, like I said earlier, that allows them to feel safe and secure when they have struggles and problems to bring you later on. Anthony,
what got you into this conversation? I mean, you're a theologian, you're a research professor, you've done lots of scholarly stuff. That this has this always been something you thought through, or is this more of a recent thing? When I say this thing, I'm talking about fatherhood, masculinity, and so on.
Yeah, that's a great question. So this all started for me a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. I was in grad school at Westminster Seminary, and I was teaching 9th grade Bible at Philmont Christian Academy. And one of the things I noticed when I walked into school as a 9th grade teacher is the demonstrative difference between the boys and the girls. You see it even more starkly now. The girls were confident, shoulders back. They had clear vision. I mean, these girls were just unbelievably sharp. I mean, it was amazing, right? But the boys, they were walking around with their heads down. Their shoulders were slumped over. They were experimenting with drugs and alcohol, which is almost always a sign of emotional distress in an adolescent. A lot of depression, not so much anxiety, but a lot of depression and hopelessness. And they were lost.
And this is 25 years ago. And this isn't like,
No, I mean, this is 1999. It's 1999. Right. So it's interesting, right? This boy crisis, I've been talking about this since the mid 90s.
Wow.
for some reason, everyone's like, "Oh, we have a crisis," and a lot of us are saying, "Hey, woohoo!" We were talking about this a long, long time ago when Bill Clinton was president, and I said, "Well, this is really strange." So a colleague of mine at the Christian school decided to have an open access for all boys. It was a men's a Bible study at a lunchtime, once a week Bible study for these lads, and we opened it up to the whole school. All right. Now we knew some boys in the school who didn't have great dads. They were really struggling. And then we opened it up to the school, and the boys who showed up who said they like really needed this stuff were the sons of the elders in the community and the pastor's boys and the professor's sons. And we were like, wait, what? And so one of the things that I recognized and I saw over the years is that the levels of boys' brokenness was irrespective of their parents' social and economic status, their status in the church. Like it had nothing to do with any of those things. And that boys were really struggling to try to figure out who they were, how they fit in society. And it was in the context of that ninth grade Bible study that we met weekly that I began to see some real kinks in the armor here. I was like, something is wrong. And so after that, I spent several years volunteering in churches and youth ministry in the suburbs of wealthy communities in St. Louis. And I saw lots of guys coming from homes where they had literally everything, but they were also chronic potheads. And I'm like, what is happening? Right. Then and then later on, I'm teaching seminary, and then my seminary students are coming to me with all these stories of a lot of woundedness and brokenness and things like that. I'm doing men's retreats. I have 45, 50-year-old men bawling in the woods because they were sexually abused and had never told anybody about it, or their dads had never told them they were proud of them or that they loved them. And so in every city I've moved, every institution I've been in, I started to see these same sorts of issues. And so I just decided that, well, listen, I can't help out the whole world, but wherever I am, I'm going to try to help the guys out in my context. And that just opened me up to wanting to do some reading. And the more reading that I did, the more I saw just the extent of the brokenness and the woundedness and some of the dysfunction. And then I thought, oh my goodness, we're about to hit a major, major crisis in the country, particularly on issues like marriage and family. I mean, if we have a whole community of just really broken men, who are your daughters going to marry? Right? Who's going to be the fathers of the next generation of kids if we don't have a really good set of dads right now? So one of the things that I focused on at King's was to do whatever I could do to get as many guys as I could ready for marriage and fatherhood. For me, their careers were tertiary, right? I didn't care so much about that, but my main focus at King's was doing whatever I could to make sure that I could get as many guys ready for marriage and being dad. So I would teach classes on this. I would have a group of guys do independent studies, and I'm very proud to say that whenever I had a group of guys do these studies, within about a year after the course ended, 40% of the guys would either be married or engaged. So I was just really trying to get them ready. There's just a lot of pain out there and a lot of men struggling in silence. And churches don't have a lot of opportunities for men in particular to work out and get some insight on how to handle some of these issues.
What about, I mean, on that note, I don't want to take us too far in a different direction, but like, how do you avoid the assumption that marriage is an inevitable part of their future? I'm concerned about sometimes the assumption that like the gospel promises that everybody will get married, and then when you're 30 35, 40, especially for women, there's this pressure that your womanhood is intrinsically connected to getting married, and there seems to be a pretty low view of singleness in the church. Obviously, I think it's obvious, but most people will get married, and that's, I think there's even where we can go back to natural law and design, and we're oriented towards each other and so on. But there is this rich theology of singleness in the New Testament too that's pretty unique. How does that factor in, like with preparing guys for marriage when there's a chance that might not be what God intends for them?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that preparation makes you a certain kind of person, right? It makes you think about yourself in relation to others a certain kind of way. It forces you to frame the ways in which you interact with women a certain kind of way, to think of yourself as a brother to women, et cetera, right? So that sort of disposition that I'm the type of man who is marriable is really the practice of chastity, right? It's you being a certain kind of person. It's almost like, for example, I'm not a dad. I don't have any kids of my own. But there's, as I've been told, I have a fatherly disposition toward my students, right? So that's a vocation, right? That's being a certain kind of person, and whether that is, I might say, operationalized within a particular institution like marriage or family, I'm not sure that's the point necessarily. The point is to develop the habits and the formation and the temperament, the values, et cetera, of being the type of person that serves that role in community, right? So to be a fatherly presence in a room, in a community, even if you don't have any kids of your own, to be a motherly presence in a context, even if you don't have kids of your own, but also to think of yourself as the sort of things I would say the scriptures invite us to think about that would make a man marriable, someone who would be desirable. Those sorts of virtues of kindness and gentleness. I would say that the cardinal virtues, but also the spiritual virtues, also we see in Ephesians 4 and 5 and the second half of Colossians 3. Yeah, cultivate those things, because you're being formed into a certain kind of person, and the community needs men and women with these values and virtues, even if they don't enter into those institutions formally.
That makes perfect sense. Yeah, I get that.
And so Catholics are much better at this, right?
Yeah.
Right? Because they have vocations where, you call a priest father. Right? A nun's called a sister. Okay. Monks are called brothers. Right. And so there's a way of becoming a certain kind of person in preparation for certain sorts of institutions. And that preparation, for example, doesn't necessarily change just because you were in a formal institution or not. So I might say it this way: growth in spiritual maturity and chastity doesn't change if you're married or single.
Hey friends, if Theology in Raw has blessed or challenged you in any significant way, would you consider supporting the show financially? You can do so through Patreon at patreon.com/Theology in the Raw. All the information is in the show notes. You can support the show for as little as $5 a month. And in doing so, you get access to all kinds of different premium content. And most of all, you just get access to the Theology in the Raw community. We have all kinds of awesome chats and messages back and forth. And it means the world to us that you support the show. As the show has grown, so have all the expenses and all the work that goes into pulling it off. So again, if you would like to support the show, you can go to patreon.com/Theology in Raw. And I just want to thank the people that are already supporting the show. Thank you so much for keeping this show not only going, but also thriving. So patreon.com/Theology in Raw. All right, here's I guess it's a controversial question, but I don't intend it to. For me, it's a genuine question, but and I'm not really, I haven't not paid attention to the zeitgeist nearly as much as you have. I have a social media account and you see stuff, and But is there a war on men? Is there a war on masculinity? What role does this whole idea of toxic masculinity play in? Has there been an overcorrection to that? You know what I'm getting at here. I mean, yeah. Anyway, I'll just throw it to you. Any direction you want to go with that? Why is Andrew Tate so popular these days? And then I have a question about your thoughts on Jordan Peterson. And
Sure.
You can go.
So Nancy Pearcey has a really great book on sort of the cultural history of toxic masculinity. I think she does a really good job of sort of framing how we got here and how that phrase emerged. And that language of war is often used. I think what we've seen is a hyper correction to the abuse of women and the neglect of women in the past. And it sort of took a life of its own, facilitated by some contemporary movements. So if we look back, of course, in history, there has been a lot of bad men. There's also been a lot of women who've experienced a lot of neglect and oppression. And one of the things that we do in this country is that we institutionalize solutions. Not only that, we try to encode or embed those solutions in public policy and in institutional policy. So one of the things that happened after the 1950s, rather after the 1960s, when a much more egalitarian spirit emerged in public education, so much of the emphasis began to be on getting girls up to the same education and professional outcomes as boys and men. The problem with the ways in which some of those were worked out is that boys were often, on the one hand, neglected, but also, and I think more potentially damaging, when boys would express the sorts of things that boys typically do in social settings, that became a problem that we needed to solve. And one of the ways in which we began to solve those problems, particularly in the 80s, was medicating boys, diagnosing them with ADD and ADHD and medicating them. I remember I saw this data about 10, 15 years ago that the U.S., we medicated our boys, diagnosed and medicated our boys for ADHD and ADD 5 times more than any developed country on the planet Earth. In fact, at the time, a boy in France couldn't even be diagnosed with this quote unquote disorder because it didn't exist in France. Boys were just boys. That phrase, boys was just boys, doesn't exist anymore, or boys will be boys. And so as the pendulum, sort of swung back and forth, we began to see some of these hyper reactions. And in the K-12 space in particular, boys were often punished and penalized for things that boys typically do. I'll give you a great example. Let's say a third grade boy was given crayons and they were say, draw a story. And the boy draws a story about a dragon who eats a cow, right? And he draws blood and things like that. They would call the parent and request a conference because the boy might have some sort of behavioral issue. Wow. And I'm like, no, but he's just drawing a dragon. So, I mean, boys fantasize about violence all the time. It's what they do, right? If you take a group of boys outside with no weapons, they will find something and use it as a weapon. It'll be a stick. It'll be your dog, right? I mean, they're going to find something to do that invites them into violence. And so we begin to see those sorts of things happen. And the more that we focused on elevating girls, we forgot about the boys. And then anything that boys did was some sort of signal that they fit into the historic framework of men who were bad and who had done bad things. So when a boy showed aggression, when he couldn't sit still, when he lost his temper. Oh, there he goes. He's just like those really, really bad patriarchal misogynists from 1920, right? And so, and it's fascinating because I actually heard a state legislator in the state of Washington say this, and I couldn't believe he said it. We were talking about the boy crisis and how boys are struggling across the board, and he said this. He said, well, because men have been historically privileged in the past, we can't really support any programs or policies to help boys now.
Wow. And
he said that. And I couldn't believe it. So what we're seeing right now is a lot of boys and young men are paying the price of the indiscretions and failures of men from previous generations. And it's really, really tragic to see that. And they're completely lost about what to do. And they don't know where they fit. And no one says that they're valuable, that they're needed. No one says that they are worthy of being cared about. And so Jordan Peterson says, hey, you guys matter. Joe Rogan says, hey, you guys matter. David Goggins says, hey, you guys matter. Right? Rollo Tomasi, hey, you guys matter. The red pill space, hey, you guys matter. The white supremacist space, you guys matter. The Hebrew Israelites, you guys matter. Right? I mean, I could just name a whole list of things that say,
and that's a spectrum. Each name, I'm like, oh, that one's pretty good. Ooh, that's not good. And that's a blend. Like it's. So you're not saying these are all like on the same page?
No, but they're all tapping into this void where no one's telling boys and men not just that they matter, but why they matter and how they matter. And so they're kind of searching for some content on that because it doesn't exist. And unfortunately, they've just been told that because they're male, they're bad. And I cannot tell you how many times, and we see this now in the data, that boys, young men, when I say young men, I'm talking 15 to 24-year-olds, will say that one of the reasons they don't approach women, because the 78% of men between the age of 15 and 24 have never asked a girl out. They've never approached a girl. That's what the data says. I'm sorry, 58%. 58% of men between the age of 15 and 24 never approached a girl. Not once. Okay. So why? Because I asked a 22-year-old about this. This is what he said to me. He said, the reason I don't do that is because I don't want to be considered a creep or a perv. Right? I don't want to be considered weird. So I just don't approach them. So the only way they can approach them is to maybe slide in their DMs, right? Or maybe do a dating app. So it's kind of created this state of affairs where guys are afraid to do things because if they do something, they'll be considered toxic or racist or a misogynist or patriarchal. So they actually do nothing. And then we shame them for doing nothing.
I see this a lot, like just in like classic chivalry, like Even I don't know what to do anymore. Like, do I open the door for a woman? Is she gonna scoff at me? Like, what do you think? You think I can't open doors? Like, or even just yesterday, I was on a bus and this older lady had this couple heavy bags and she was kind of loading them up, and I hesitated. Like 10 years, up until 5 years ago, I would have jumped up out of my seat, taken her bags, put them. But now I had so many thoughts going through my head. Like, is she going to be offended at that? Is she going to think I'm taking her bag? Am I going to get accused of assault or something? Maybe, but like he came at me, so I hesitated for like a few seconds, and then somebody else, helped her out. And then I was like, and she was like, oh, thank you so much. I was like, gosh, what I don't know. Like, or even open the doors for girls and stuff. I would say sometimes I do, sometimes I don't, just because like I'm just like kind of reading the situation. I'm hesitant. So I'm like, I don't want to be perceived as this like patriarchal, misogynist person, and some people might interpret it that way. What are your thoughts? Like, is that pretty common? I mean,
well, I mean, I do the same thing. I guarantee you, if you ask the average man, he's going to self-regulate, just like you said today. And especially if he's a high school or college student or in his 20s, I guarantee he's going to have a whole list of things that he doesn't know what to do because he doesn't want to get accused of something. I mean, I do the very same thing. If I'm in an elevator with a woman, I'm not small talking. This is not going to happen. I'm on my phone. And when the doors open, I leave first. Right? Every single time. Because I want him to think, oh, maybe he's following me. I just like, no, I'm not looking at you. I'm going to leave first. And if you think I'm rude, I guess I'm just going to have to be rude. So what I don't want to do is hold the door and say, you go out and I walk behind you and then you get nervous and think it's this guy a stalker or something. So doors open, I just leave first, right? I mean, and those are the sorts of things that guys are having to do, and this is really confusing right now. And this is why they're so drawn to guys who just tell them what to do, right? So they're drawn to the self-improvement movement on YouTube. They're drawn to these dating coach, these guys who tell them how to date, right? Give them 8 points on a YouTube video in terms of how to date. They're really, really drawn again to the Andrew Tates of the world, because they just tell them what to do, and then they just do that. They trust those guys, and they believe that, well, I got to do something, because not having direction and not knowing is way too debilitating and confusing. So they essentially are drawn to this content for some direction because they really just don't know what to do. I mean, it's so fascinating because I've both heard, and this is in the college space, I've both heard girls complain that guys ask them out all the time, and I've heard them complain that guys don't ask them out. Right. And so guys are like, well, what are we supposed to do? I mean, should we ask you out or should we not ask you out? And they often don't know. Those sort of signals aren't really there. And the other thing is that you're sort of just talking about relationships. I think, unfortunately, a lot of parents have inadvertently, and this isn't on purpose, of course, but sort of drop the ball on forming their kids and how to start relationships, right? Teaching you how to flirt, right? How to engage, how to start a relationship, what kinds of things should you do? They're just out there on their own, right? We focus on their schooling, we focus on sports, we focus on hygiene, everything else. But the kind of questions that guys are having and girls are having about relationships, we often wait until they're in one before the advice comes, instead of saying, hey, if you want a relationship and if you want a good one, these are the sorts of things that you should do in order to form one.
Yeah, that's good, man. Well, what are your thoughts on Jordan Peterson? I know he's such a cultural.
Yeah,
I almost said icon. He's a cultural something, right? Cultural signal, or yeah. I was looking at one of his books on Amazon, the 12 Rules for Life book, and I think it has something like 70,000 reviews, and I was like, I have a book, it has 10, and I'm like, I'm like, how did this happen? So Jordan Peterson is a classic example of a Jungian psychologist. And we saw this very same phenomenon happen in the mid 1990s in that first kind of Ms. movement with Sam Keen, who was at Harvard, and Robert Bly and all those guys. And they were also tapping into these Jungian categories of archetypes, right? Yeah. And so Jordan Peterson, as a Jungian psychologist, is true to form. And he basically took what we were talking about in the mid 90s and took that exact same conversation to the present. But here's what was different. No social media. So what did he do? It was brilliant. He took clips of his class and put them on YouTube. Brilliant. Right? So now everyone could sample in sort of like 3 to 7 minute chunks the applications of Jungian psychology, the use of archetypes and things like that. So guess what? He blew up, right? Now, as Jordan Peterson goes on the psych stuff, I really learn a lot from that. I have been exposed to a lot of Jungian psychology over the years, and I think
on the psychology stuff. Jordan Peterson is pretty spot on in that Jungian framework. When he leaves psychology, I just kind of ignore him, really. So he's on this Bible tour. I think he's doing Exodus right now, or his lectures on Genesis. Yeah. I just ignore that because what he's doing is what Carl Jung did, which was instrumentalize the biblical story as utility, as an example, as an archetype of certain principles in Jungian psychology. So Carl Jung, people don't realize this, has a commentary on the book of Job.
He does?
Yeah, of course he does. Yeah, wow. Yes, he does. He does. Right. So Peterson's not doing anything that Jung didn't do. And I think people are so used to Freud.
Yeah.
They're so used to the Freudian school and the Freudian framework that they don't understand that the Jungian school has a long history of practitioners, but also theorists that continue to operate, and they tend to operate in really gendered spaces. Now, one of the things I did at King's is in a class, because people were like, "Oh, Jordan Peterson." I'm like, I got the 12 Rules of Life book, and I was like, "You got to be kidding me! This is right in the Book of Proverbs." So this is what I did in class. I had my students read Jordan Peterson's book, The 12 Rules of Life, and the Book of Proverbs at the same time. And what was the big aha moment? And I knew this would happen. He is saying nothing that's not already in the wisdom literature. Nothing.
Yeah.
Right. So he has rules like always do not lie.
Yeah.
Wow. Don't lie. That's amazing. And so I went to one of his lectures, and he's on stage extolling the virtues of being truthful and why telling lies is a really bad thing. And people are taking notes. Right? They're on their phones, they're going crazy. They're just like, oh my gosh, like I cannot believe the power of not lying. Like telling the truth is amazing. Did you hear what he said? He said we shouldn't lie. Oh my, I can't believe he said that. I mean, did you know that we should lie? Bro, we shouldn't tell lies. I mean, being truthful and honest, right? And being precise in our speech. Can you imagine? This is one of the other rules, be precise in your speech. And people are like, be precise in your speech, man. Like, this guy's amazing. Right? And I'm thinking, and I had the students see this, this is already here. Thousands of years of reflection on this has already been had. So what I basically had them ask is, why is it, well, I asked them this, we reflected on this, why is it that people are drawn to Jordan Peterson and not the Book of Proverbs? Since the content on some of that life advice is really not that different. Right? Like what is it? What is it about it? And essentially, and this is sort of my own conjecture, is that what Jordan Peterson is really good at is application of why those things matter. Right? Which is a principle in preaching, right? The main thing your sermon should do is be applicable. People need to see on the ground where it matters. The Africans refer to it as foot on the ground theology, right? So when people aren't able to read the scriptures for themselves and then immediately know how it applies in their life, it seems that the biblical narrative is distant and far away. And I think potentially people are in context where the practical applications are not very apparent, or they just don't get them. So this is what I see. When I see young men drawn to Jordan Peterson, drawn to Rollo Tomasi, drawn to David Goggins, here's the difference. And I rant about this at conferences. It is immediately applicable. They'll watch a 4-minute YouTube video, and then that day there's a context for them to do it because they're given really specific things to do. And unfortunately, in a lot of in the evangelical world, giving people a thing to do has been somehow poo-pooed as legalism, right? And so this is what's happened inadvertently. What we need young men and boys to do is just understand the gospel, know the gospel, because if you try to get them to do anything, hold on. You're putting, hold on. You're
Yeah.
putting the imperative in front of the indicative. I can't do that.
Mm-hmm.
Can't do that. We're going to have a whole conference about why the indicative must come before the imperative. And I'm like, you got to be kidding me, dude. Like, have you ever read this Bible book? I mean, it's a both and. It's not like step one and then step two. And and what happened, it's just so tragic, because there's been so much of an emphasis on this framework that you can't tell people to do anything unless they get the gospel right.
Mm-hmm.
Has basically left a whole generation of boys and men lost. Because what they need is very clear direction, but they also need that direction situated and explained in the appropriate context to know why and how it matters, and to not have necessarily their identities defined by their success or failure at doing those things. That's really more the issue, right? And so what do these YouTube self-improvement guys do? There's a guy named Hamza Ahmed. He's got about, I haven't looked recently, but maybe 2 million subscribers. I stumbled upon him when he had maybe 50,000. In the span of, and I'm not exaggerating, 3 or 4 years, he's risen. And what's Hamza Ahmed doing? He's giving them extremely practical wisdom on how to do things like manage your money, how to break your porn addiction, how to break your video game addiction, how to work out, how to talk to girls. This practical stuff.
Wow.
And so Jordan Peterson is incredibly practical when he does that Jungian psychology stuff. Now, I haven't really sampled all of the biblical stuff. I have heard that on his most recent tour, he's a bit more esoteric and a lot less applicable. But in those early days, he would just say, and this is one of the things that because I would show his videos in class and watch students react. He says things like this: you can't bend the morality that's in the universe. He would just say stuff like that, just classical Jungian stuff. And he says this: I've never seen anybody get away with anything ever. He said in his counseling practice, I've never in my life seen anybody get away with anything ever. It eventually catches up with you and undermines you. And I'm like, that's exactly right. In fact, the Bible says that too.
Yeah.
Right. So when he tells guys, he says, guys, listen, you have to be honest in your dealings with people. Right. You can't cheat them. You can't be a scoundrel, because you will not get away with it. So he'll give an example. When you're at work, do this. When you're with your spouse, do that. Right. So he makes it really, really concrete. And that level of applicability where they can see where and how it matters, I think a lot of young men are not experiencing that level of applicability in their churches, because their churches are just so incapacitated by the fact that they have to get their theology right first, which is exactly what Jesus didn't do. The disciples didn't get it until after the resurrection, maybe. No, I'm kidding. But like the whole time Jesus was with them, they didn't get it. But what did he do? Even with jacked up and impartial theology, he sent them out to heal the sick and to cast out demons. They were busy doing the work, even though they didn't understand it completely. And we don't treat boys and young men that way. And unfortunately, I think there's been some distance that's been introduced between what the Bible says and how to live. And these influencers are filling that gap for them.
I think that's a great, I love that you're looking at not just the narrow specifics of what maybe Jordan Peterson's saying, but let's step back and look at how can we understand this cultural moment and why he's having maybe such an impact. And it's coming in waves. For me, I see like 2 different Jordan Petersons. There's the old one and the new one. Old one I was intrigued by. I thought I listened to a lot of like long form interviews, where his humanity really came out. Seems like a really genuine, honest person. Like genuinely curious, and honest with where he's at with things. And And his self-help stuff that I read most of the 12 Rules for Life, and it's like, he got thrown into so much controversy with the transgender stuff. And I think that was unfortunate because when people think of him, a lot of people think it's just that. Well, that's something he was kind of drawn into, and he was trying to figure out how to navigate that. But he's primarily, a Jungian self-help guru, and a lot of the stuff he said, 12 Rules for Life, a lot of it's just like you said, I was like, this is all good stuff. It's not new, but it's great. But then there's a newer Jordan Peterson once he went to like the Daily Wire, and he just seems a lot more angry, or just militant-ish. I don't know. He just feels kind of different now. But I'm more interested in how can a guy go and give a 2.5-hour lecture on a short passage in the Old Testament, and thousands of people, most of whom aren't even religious, will pay money to go hear that. I'm more interested in that. In a day when preachers are like, how can I get people to attend church more than once, maybe twice a month? How can I keep them engaged during my 30-minute sermon? And these are Christians. So how can we learn? What is he doing? And he is practical, but he's also incredibly, esoteric, in depth. I mean, I listened to one on the flood he did years ago, and he spent like 2 hours of introductory material. And then it was one of the funniest lines I've heard. He's going on and on and on and on and on. And it's like, he's already 2 hours in. He's like, all right, so that's all introduction. Now let's get to the, can you imagine? And he's got people paying money to hear, and whether they agree with it or not, it's an incredibly academic-ish lecture on the Bible. So what can Christian preachers preaching to people who actually say they want to hear, who believe this stuff, what's he doing that we're not doing,
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the things I hear from young men in particular is they believe that Jordan Peterson cares about them.
I would 100% agree. If you listen to his long form conversations, and I know some people just don't like him and whatever, but like, if you listen to his long form conversations, and he, I think is a genuine. I think if he's in a room, I think he's going to listen to anything you have to say, genuinely.
Yeah. So whenever I go to college campuses and speak to fraternities now, one of the comments I always get from these guys is, "Thank you for caring about us." And I was like, "Wait, what?" At first it kind of shook me. Or they'll say things like, "Man, nobody talks to us," because I try to encourage them to be great men. It's like, well, no one talks to us like this. They feel completely abandoned. Like no one cares about us. Like no one cares about us. And that's really we talked about toxic masculinity earlier. I think that's part of the signal they've been receiving, is that no one cares. No one cares what happens to us. No one cares about us. No one cares about our struggles, our pain, our issues. No one cares about us. So what am I going to do? I'm just going to resign and play video games, look at porn, smoke weed, and maybe DoorDash, right? Because no one really cares about me. So they act like no one cares about them. But Jordan Peterson communicates that he cares about them, and I also think that a lot of evangelicals have unfortunately listened to too much corporate BS about what people want. Right? Yeah. Like listening to these marketing gurus and these business guys, like, hey, your sermon, you shouldn't talk to people for more than 20 minutes. You need to have slides. You've got to have, you got to make them laugh. So these pastors like comedians and stuff like that. And that whole thing's a big show. You can't on stage, you can't have a pulpit. And I'm like, this is just so stupid. Yeah. When the speakers that are drawing the biggest audiences are all long form, right? They're long form. People are dying for deep content. And what Jordan Peterson does is he gives deep content, but also makes it applicable, and it's long form. I think people also respect him because he's smart. Yeah. Right. Like, and they can tell that they trust him because he's smart. And we began to see this, I'm not saying this to be offensive. It's just historical. But in the 1840s, we saw a shift in who went to seminary, in America. And in the 1840s, before the 1840s, it was really prestigious to be a minister, right? We know the Ivy League started as minister training institutions. Well, right when the Industrial Revolution began to really pick up steam, no pun intended, a lot of really sharp, competent, smart men, the brain drain went there. It went to building things, creating things, etc. Beginning around the 1840s, we began to see men that weren't as competent or as analytical entering a seminary. So the pastorate became a sort of became a different type of leader. And so it's pretty rare. I think Tim Keller was one of those exceptions. It's pretty rare that you see young men who are like, oh, my pastor's brilliant, I want to be like him because he's really smart. He reads a lot of books. He's really, really impressive. And I mean, I don't know a lot of young guys who say, if I asked them, like, name a man that you want to be like, they would name a pastor. Right.
Wow.
But what happens? Because I mean, when they go to seminary and they want to be like their seminary professors, okay, they want to go get a Ph.D. and they come back and teach seminary, etc. But I think a lot of young guys, they see Jordan Peterson. He's smart, he's competent, he knows his stuff, he has a stage presence, and he's compassionate. And they're like, I want to be like that. I trust what he says, and I will listen to him as long as I need to listen to him to get some really practical nuggets to help me improve my life, because I believe that this man cares about me and people like me.
That's a great analysis. Real quick, I know we're out of time. Real quick, what should a Christian parent, leader, pastor take away from this? Like, what's the Christian response? I know we kind of gone in various directions, but what is the Christian response to this for lack of better terms, overcorrection, maybe against kind of masculinity, calling it?
Yeah, I mean, so what it seems that boys and young men need is a third space that's not home, that's not school, where older men are forming them, where they're cared about, where they're listened to, where they're challenged to do hard things, where they have a space where they can ask the quote unquote dumb questions, where they have a space where they can bring their struggles and troubles, and they have a community of adults that care about them. One of the things that we're seeing right now emerge in some of the psych data about adolescence is that the most predictive variable in thriving and happiness for young adults is if they had a network of older adults who cared about them when they were preteens and teens, right? So what they really need, they don't need more travel sports. They don't need more nonprofit volunteer hours. What they need are relationships. They need people other than their parents who care about them individually and deeply. They need mentors. They need coaches. I'm reading this book right now called Never Enough, which is about raising kids in high achievement culture. And this one group of moms just decided with these girls in Palo Alto, California, that each girl has 5 moms to serve as a 911 call, right? 5 moms. Each girl gets 5 adult women that they can talk to about stress, about dating, about grades, about whatever, right? Drugs and alcohol, whatever. They have 5 moms they can call on, right? That's the level of engagement and interaction and relational formation that our teens really need to thrive. This idea that they need a lot of good peers on one hand is right, but what really leads to long-term thriving, what the data is really clear about, is adults. They need to be deeply embedded in an adult community. And so what parents and pastors and leaders can do, particularly in a church context, and this is really, really controversial, I would say they what they need to do is upend their youth ministries and maybe dismantle them completely and think about how do we integrate our preteens and teens into relationships with everybody else in the church. Isolating them from adults is actually undermining their long-term thriving, both spiritually, emotionally, et cetera. And this is really low-hanging fruit. I mean, this is low-hanging fruit, right? If you have a men's retreat, bring the boys on it. If you have a women's retreat, bring the girls, right? If there's a small group, the teens should be a part of that. They shouldn't be separated from those sorts of things. So as what I'm seeing when I go around the country and talk, and this is not rocket science, is that the boys just need to know that they're cared about.
Yeah.
And they need to experience that in multiple ways, both inside their home and outside of it in a community. And I just think the church is the best place for boys to be celebrated, to be cared about, to know that they're missed, to know that they have value, and to know that their presence is felt. Sorry, that their absence is felt. That their presence really does bring a difference. And there's nothing better than to have a group of adults to actually do that.
Real quick, I have to ask this question because this is really relevant for me. Non-parental other adults, are there just limitations on how much the parent can pour into their kid? Or are there certain, it's just inevitable that your kid is going to want to maybe share things with other adults and not with their parents, even if your parental relationship is just as perfect as it can be. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I've read one book by Stephen Bulldap, and I think the book is titled How to Raise a Boy. He has a whole chapter in there on why parents need to choose a mentor for their son, and how good that is. Now that naturally happens in things like sports, right? It's probably a coach or something like that. It naturally happens in something maybe like Boy Scouts, even in band. It could be the band teacher, something like that. Mm-hmm. But yeah, every boy needs a mentor. He needs somebody else that's not parents to basically reaffirm exactly what the parents are teaching. Right now, this has happened to me for years and years and years and years. I'll have a student come to my office and tell me something. I'll tell them, hey, that's a bad idea. You should do that. And they'll be like, whoa,
my parent was right all along.
Guess what? That's what my mom said. I'm like, well, your mom is right. Right? Or like, that's what my dad said. So I've got several friends of mine where I've been able to form some really close relationships with their kids. Right. So sometimes I'll get a phone call from one of my friends' kids in high school or college. We'll just talk about stuff, right? Now, because I'm friends with their parents, I'm not going to tell them anything that their parents aren't going to tell them, right? But they have another person, another voice, another trustworthy context space in which they can share and ask questions. Because the context of relationships is a bit different, the shame potential, right? The level of trust, is punishment going to come? Those sort of things are really changed, are really, really different. But yes, I mean, and this goes back to Christian Smith's early work.
Oh yeah,
that preteens and teens need a network of adults, network of adults. And in previous generations, where we weren't isolated in the suburbs with fences and garages, when we lived in dense communities, and when we lived in close proximity to our family members, that 100 years ago, those other adults would have naturally been uncles, cousins, grandparents, right? It was just a part of how we lived. But now, because we chase careers and we live in big gated communities, and you don't know your neighbor, et cetera, it's really become incumbent upon churches and parents and leaders to provide a network of adults that provides a sense of mattering for kids. It is absolutely vital, even if your relationship with your kids is fantastic. One last point here for me is that some of the best results that I've seen in the mentoring I've done over the last 25 years or so has actually been with boys and young men who were close to their fathers.
Oh, wow.
It's yielded unbelievable results. And it's not because I was filling a void, but I was another champion of them and reinforcing the sorts of things that they got from home. And those have been some of the greatest long-term results that I've seen in the lives of men. And I've been doing this since 1999, and I've been tracking with the same group of guys. And the ones who were doing exceptional, they also had great relationships with their dads. I've just come alongside to support and champion those very same things. So if you're a parent of a teen or a preteen, it's a really, really good idea for you all as parents to choose someone else to mentor. You might use the phrase disciple, or to make contributions to the formation of your children. And the parents need to be the one to do that. We used to have this role of godparent. This is what godmothers and godfathers were actually designed to do. And in a lot of traditions, we've moved away from that. But that's the role that godfathers and godmothers were supposed to take.
Anthony, thank you so much for being on Theology and Raw. This has been a fascinating conversation. Where can people find you and your work?
Just Google me. You can Google me and put the word Twitter in there or X. I'm there. You can also Google me and the word website. You can just Google Anthony Bradley and website, and it will pop up.
I love when people ask me, so where can people buy your books? I'm like, what year is this? Like, really?
I know. Yeah, you can Google my name. You can find the people that love me and the people that hate me that way as well.
You definitely have both, as we all do. Well, thanks again for being on the show, man. Really appreciate you.
Thanks for having me.
This show is part of the Converge Podcast Network.